Hello, everyone. Hope you all had a wonderful lunch. I am very pleased, Eric Brakey, the new Executive Director of the Free State Project. Very pleased. I guess you can applaud for that. You don't have to. Very pleased to introduce our two panelists today for a conversation on cannabis policy across in two states, a tale of two states, and how they relate to that leaf. We have from the faraway, distant state of Maine, just across the border, Representative David Boyer. David has been in the Liberty movement for probably like a decade and a half, as long as I have been. We both actually got our start together on the Ron Paul campaign in 2012. We're both, let's give it up to Ron Paul. Ron Paul, everyone. And the Fed. Yeah, anyway. So David started as a field staffer on the Ron Paul campaign in 2012. He and I launched an organization for a while called the Defense of Liberty PAC, where we focused on getting Liberty candidates elected to the state legislature, which we had some moderate success at, more success later. He went on to become the state director for the Marijuana Policy Project and led the effort to legalize cannabis for adult use in the state of Maine by referendum. He's now serving his first term in the Maine State House of Representatives, where he serves on the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee, which deals with all the vices, gambling, drinking, and cannabis, and also veterans issues, right? Which meant that he got to vote for Defend the Guard and was a great champion there. So get up to Representative David Boyer. And I'm afraid I don't have any notes, and so I'm not going to be able to give as long and extensive an introduction of our other panelist, Representative Layon. I pronounced that right?
Yes, you did.
I'll leave it to her to introduce herself, other than I'm sure she's doing great work on cannabis policy in New Hampshire, which is why she's on this panel today. And anyway, thank you to both of our panelists.
Yeah. Thank you. And so I'll do the voiceover for you. Erica Layon is now a state representative. That's me. I've been involved in politics for a while going back, and actually Jim Forsyth brought Ron Paul to a breakfast with us at Mary Ann's Diner, and so that was a great opportunity to reconnect with a friend from skydiving with the Ron Paul campaign. We had an event at our house, Leap for Liberty, where we were going to fly with 70-foot-long banners behind the parachutes landing. But the clouds were at treetops, so we weren't able to jump. But we still had 200 people at our house when we had 2 inches of rain in the 2 hours that he spoke. Bill Domenico back there did the light show on it. And we had a photographer who was supposed to do photos, but he got won over for Liberty by listening to Ron Paul, and he forgot to take pictures. And that's how we spread this whole message. So I ended up deciding to run for state representative during COVID so that I could work against the backlash. I've always had interest in legalizing cannabis. I ended up signing on as a co-sponsor last year on the bill that was going through as a free market. And as vice chairman of the Health and Human Services Committee, we work on a lot of therapeutic cannabis. So we had a bill that had gone to conference committee, and in that, the Senate wanted to have, because our bill got killed by the Senate, same thing, because it didn't meet the requirements for the governor, they ended up wanting to have a commission to study the legalization of cannabis because the governor said that it needed to be state-run. So in that conference committee that I ran, they were charged with drafting legislation for a state-run model. And that failed. I saw that it was on its way to failing, and then I worked with people who had been involved previously with the Hampshire Cannabis Association and various people in order to bring an updated for your market version of cannabis legalization in case the effort of the commission did not work. So that commission fell apart, it failed, and the Senate didn't introduce one. So here I was, the prime sponsor of the bill, the only bill for cannabis legalization, with a co-sponsor who isn't particularly aligned with Liberty Forum. I know some of you see these little buttons, these things from the list, the anti-democracy extremists that every one of us here that's noted as attending will become a part of. She actually had a podcast on it. But cannabis brings us together. because this is something that divides both, that brings people together from a lot of perspectives. And so not only is it about legalizing, but it's about building bonds beyond that. But I probably want to turn it over to Representative Boyer to talk about what's going on in Maine so we can understand what a new cannabis market looks like. And then I can talk a little bit about what we're trying to do here in New Hampshire.
Thank you. I'll just give you a brief history of weed. So medical cannabis was authorized in 1999 through a ballot initiative. It was pretty narrowly tailored. It got further expanded in 2009 through another ballot initiative, and that set up dispensaries, so just physical stores. Previously, patients were served by caregivers who were only allowed to serve 6 patients at a time, and only grow about 36 plants each, so very, very cottage industry. And 2008 happened, 2009, there's 8 dispensaries. One of the companies from out of state gets 4 out of the 8, so that created a lot of drama. And then 2009 to about 2018, the market proliferates. The caregivers start to get more sophisticated in their facilities, and also going around the law. They figured, hey, let's have 5 patients, and we'll rotate a slot for the 6 patients, and then we can serve everyone. There was still kind of this civil war going on between a couple thousand caregivers and the 8 dispensaries. And Senator Breakey, when he was on the HHS committee, chairing that committee, did a great job in 2018 to bring those folks together and expand and allow for caregiver storefronts, remove some of the qualifying conditions to make it easier for people to become patients. And that was 2018. So actually 2 years before that, we passed legalization. So it's been a kind of a wonky timeline. I got hired in 2012, 2013 with the Marijuana Policy Project. And at the beginning, we started in Portland, did a local initiative in Portland to make cannabis legal. It was mostly symbolic, but it gave us earned media opportunities to talk about cannabis and how it is safer than alcohol. That was pretty much our biggest message for 4 years, is that cannabis is safer than alcohol. It's less addictive, less toxic. It doesn't make people really angry and violent like alcohol can. So why would we drive adults to the more harmful substance? Why would we punish adults who choose the safer substance? So we used that messaging in the 2013 local referendum. We did some more in 2014 in South Portland, Lewiston, and York, Maine. And then we went on to collect 100,000 signatures to put this on the ballot in Maine in 2016. I think cannabis would have been legal and probably by about 2016 in New Hampshire if New Hampshire had a citizens initiative process. I think you guys don't have that, but you also have like 400 and some reps. So you have a lot of access and citizen representation in that way. But as we know, the politicians are behind the people on this issue and other social issues that the citizens initiative process is good for. It also can do some harm when we're talking about taxing and fiscal matters. Anyway, so we collected the signatures, got it on the ballot, passed it. The governor wouldn't implement it at the time, Governor LePage. So it took till 2020 to start adult use sales. And we did that in the middle of pandemic. And it's worked so far. We're trying to reduce the taxes. We know that it's hurting businesses already in Maine, that they're on payment plans with Maine Revenue Services because of the excise tax. So, they're earning a lot of money for the state and a lot of tax revenue, but we need to make sure that they can stay out there and do it and that it's sustainable. And then we're also just dealing with some of the over-regulations that were a trade-off of getting this passed with the ballot initiative process. And we call those like Cannabis Policy 1.0. And some states are there and they have to go. You can't go to 2 before you go to 1, unfortunately. Hopefully the experience in our state can hopefully have you guys close that gap and have smarter policies sooner, but I understand, politics doesn't always work that way. So we're trying to make sure it's a local industry. We can't keep people from a way out of our industry because of this thing called the Commerce Clause. But we're still want to make sure that locals have an opportunity and that the barriers to entry are very low. So it's interesting to talk with Erica and how it's going in New Hampshire and comparing and contrasting.
Thank you. I guess looking at some of the recent legislative action that's happened on cannabis, it's something that always passes the House. The Senate's always the problem. Back in 2021, there was a big pivot to 2022, there was a pivot to have the State Liquor Commission open cannabis stores, much like the liquor stores that you see along the highway. The nice, big, market-growing, family-friendly liquor stores. With what we just heard, that might make sense because if the Liquor Commission is worried about losing sales, then perhaps they want to make sure that they're still involved in that. That one had passed the House by 7 votes. Only 7 votes to pass the House that'll pass just about anything that has cannabis written on it. Was pretty interesting to see. That one died in the Senate because the governor had his reasons why it wasn't going to pass. In last year, 639, it was a beautiful, wonderful freer market one. It still had a lot more regulation than most of us in this room would like to see, but it was a good path forward, and that one passed, I think, 270-something votes. So that had, you'd have to have 70 people to switch their votes in order for it to fail because we have 400 representatives. And that's the one where the Senate had it, they killed it, and then the next day the governor set out his list of requirements. His requirements were that the state control all advertising, and there's a number of them. So I'll run through those requirements that he has and a little bit more with our bill. So as I had said before, then there was that liquor commission, commission for state-run model, and I didn't have much confidence they'd succeed. So we wrote this bill, we brought it forward, and because the people in the Senate who wanted to do this failed to ever file a bill, now it's a matter of not having two competing ideas freely competing in the legislature. But now it's a matter of whether we keep this model that's a very, very, very tightly regulated state-run model, but where there's not an operational control. Through regulation, we actually wouldn't allow advertising, which to me, as a liberty-leaning Republican, seemed absolutely awful. But our requirement within this was that the state control all advertising. So do we want the state promoting cannabis? Do we want to have tax dollars that we don't want to spend going to promoting cannabis? And do we want to have a bunch of people that have never used cannabis using it now because it's legal and let's try it? That also seemed like a big problem. So the idea of addressing this by saying, we're going to have no advertising. The more I looked at it, the more I recognized it actually is a feature because the bill allows to have advertising if somebody goes to Weed Maps. If somebody's going to anything that's already cannabis related, there can be advertising on those sites. But you need to be seeking it out in order to find any of that advertising. Because a lot of the problem that you see in other states is when suddenly grandpa's going to the store and eating a couple of those brownies and then he doesn't feel it and he has another one. It's the whole newbie problems, and we don't want to grow the market with newbie problems. So as we look forward, we move forward, there's the state-run model. And so having it state-run reaches back to liquor. In New Hampshire, we have the Liquor Commission that runs everything. That's because with the 21st Amendment, when it was first opened up, that allowed that pathway for the state to be involved directly in the sales as we were coming back in. There's others that are a little bit more specialized in that process. So some of these control states literally have the government selling liquor like they do in New Hampshire. And there's others that use this really tight regulatory control as opposed to a freer market that you'd see in an open regulatory state an open control state for liquor. So within that, we have it so that the Liquor Commission can set rules about just about everything except for wages and prices what kind of the specifics on it. Obviously, we wouldn't allow them to sell cotton candy that's cannabis because that's just not where the world is right now. We don't want to have a kid picking up cotton candy and not knowing what it is. But it also would allow the fact that, adults like to have something that might have a picture of cherries on it because they also like cherry-flavored foods, and to draw that balance. So as we worked through it and had this process, I think that we've delivered a really, really good bill that if we're able to get it through the House and get it over to the Senate, I think it stands a good chance because as we look at it and talk to people in the Senate, there's quite a few people, I think potentially enough, even without the senator who wants to start up the franchise model, I think we have enough votes to pass it over in the Senate. So as we look at this whole process right now, or I guess maybe we can talk a little bit more about yours because I feel like I'm getting a little bit too into the weeds on the policy part. We'll talk about Maine a little bit, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about what's happening right now.
Yeah, no, you guys are kicking our ass on every other thing. Like, no wonder Eric moved, you guys have a good economy, low taxes, lots of freedoms. But this weed thing is just a sticking point for you guys, and I think part of it is the lack of the citizens' initiative process. I think that's a big part of it. But these are important conversations to have, and it's important for folks to draw the line where they is important, and whether or not that means home grow, no home grow, if it means state run, no state run. How much does it rank for liberty for you, for where you're at, for how many arrests happen? It was, an easier calculation in Maine because, our bill allowed for home grow. That was really important to me. And I had a bill to further expand it that passed this last year. So we went back to the original 6 plants per adult, no limit per household, 12 immature seedlings immature plants per adult, unlimited seedlings. I think we have the most expansive home grow program in the country, and the sky hasn't fallen. But these things about cotton candy and cherry, we're dealing with that in Maine with a regulator who is using the law to really just go after operators and on things that aren't even maybe in the rules or the statute, even if you can believe government would do such a thing. It sounds a little silly, but yes, some of these reps, we have to say adults like sugar too. Adults like cherries too. We can't, put children up at this like altar and just use them to use them for policy when they have nothing to do with it. They're not going to sell to kids in New Hampshire. You have to be 21 to buy there. We check IDs. That's what the illicit market isn't doing right now. So. And when you put it next to alcohol, and my committee regulates alcohol like cannabis, so we see it firsthand. There's the infused whipped cream now, and chocolate milk, and Fireball, and cotton candy vodka. So don't give me this shit about appealing to kids and stick it all on the cannabis folks. Well, alcohol, can do whatever the hell they want with it and have 18-wheelers with Coors Light on it. But they're giving fines to a friend of mine who is just advertising in a free newspaper, alternative, magazine that's just free at the Hannafords. And they're saying, well, there's a high likelihood a kid could get to it. It's like, give me a break. And do we really want to shield the children from this? Is that good public policy? We know prohibition doesn't work. You see in Europe they have lower rates of binge drinking, right? That's because they can drink when they see over the bar counter. But I'm not saying that kids necessarily should be able to consume cannabis in this country before 21. But if you're honest about the relative harms of cannabis and alcohol, and you have a conversation with the kid, I think that's going to lead to better results. It's an important discussion, and whatever regulations you give up on 1.0, it's tough to get back. So think hard, and if it has to do with money, it's even harder. We're having a heck of a time trying to lower the excise tax for these folks. The Democrats, and I had success with my bill passing, but you have to fund a tax cut, and the way you budget it, I guess the politicians say. So this tax cut is going to cost about $10 million, and the Democrats are in control in Maine, and they don't want to fund it. We're trying to get it funded, but we're not holding our breath. And so I guess just think hard on those regulations and make sure the juice is worth the squeeze.
So on your taxing in Maine, you said you have the excise tax. So there's a retail tax and an excise tax. Where do each of those happen?
Yes. So we have the original initiative had only a 10% sales tax. After it got rewritten in 2018 by the legislature, they opted for a 10% point of sale sales tax, and then they wanted a roughly 10% excise tax, but instead of saying just 10% of the cost of cannabis, wholesale, they decided to make a flat fee of $334 a pound, and their rationale was, well, cannabis use is only going to stay the same or grow, so we'll know we can count on this as we can budget for it. Whereas if you just had a percentage base, it would go down over time because competition and legalizing it makes the price go down, right? So, but now that $330 used to be 10% of a pound, but now it's 20% of a pound, if not more. So that's how what we're dealing with, and I have a bill to lower it to $150 and it passed in the committee, but again, it'll pass in the House and Senate, I think, and it probably won't get funded. But cannabis is now, I think, the number one cash crop in Maine. It's a $500 million industry in Maine. Even with competition from the illicit market, we're dealing with Chinese illegal grows. I don't know if you've heard if that's made the news over in New Hampshire. But this is organized crime, growing cannabis illegally in hundreds of houses around Maine, going to New York, most of it, I imagine, because you can't make much money selling weed in Maine anymore. So I think we go to buy our alcohol in New Hampshire, and I think New Hampshire will continue to come to Maine to buy their weed.
So with that, you think that even with my heavy regulation one and only a 10% tax rate at the retail, that one might have a chance of being competitive with Maine, but it still depends on how heavy the regulation is. The two other real pain points for the industry is the seed to sell software that has made its way into all these regulated markets. The biggest one is called Metric, and basically you have to do it every day, put it in. They track every gram of cannabis, and it's mandated, and it's really kind of clunky and takes a lot of time. And you have to pay for each tag to go on each plant, so it's cumbersome and costly. And then the other expensive besides the tax itself and the energy costs in Maine, would be the testing regime. So adult use in Maine has mandated testing, whereas medical cannabis doesn't. And a lot of folks think that's kind of counterintuitive, and I would agree, most would, but that's just kind of how it came into effect and into existence. But the requirement for each panel is $300-400 for each panel for every 10 or 20 pounds, I think. And so when you're looking at that, we set our mold limits way too low, like 10,000 ccm or CCU. Other states have it at 100,000. New York's coming online. They don't have a pass or fail. They just say just label it. So, but we're making operators test for pesticides that maybe they know they don't use. And instead of we're trying to move to an audit type testing where if you pass 10 times, then maybe you only have to, you get checked up on, and at the same time, the state's doing a secret kind of shopper program where they're testing that way as well. But your 10%, if we don't fix some of our issues, it definitely could be competitive. Thank you. That's really helpful to know. So I'd love to be able to say it's the competing bill. But we have this other amendment or this other copy that keeps showing up in committees coming over from the Senate. But that's not really how the House generally operates. Usually, if you're a senator, you do things in the Senate. And if you're a representative, you do it in the House. But sometimes we work together and we help each other out in order to bring bills forward. So this other one that has a franchise model, one of the things they're looking to do is have a 12% tax at retail on everything, including medical. Ours does not have a tax on medical because as medical marijuana, it already has a higher cost because there is so much that goes into that process. And just because it's so regulated, it's so expensive. So we'd have 10% only on adult use. That one's looking at 12.5% on everything. But that one also gives the Liquor Commission the sole authority to set prices on all cannabis. So that's not just the price at the store. That I'm on the Joint Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, and all we can do when rules come through is say whether or not it meets the law that's passed. If it doesn't violate the laws and if it doesn't violate the Constitution, then we can't really say anything about it. We can hope that they can make changes we like, but we can't ask them to. And quite frankly, even if it breaks the law, they can still force it through. So the way it's written that they would set the prices on all cannabis products, that would allow them within that letter of the law to have rules where they set the price of the plants, because that would be within that process. The wholesale, moving to the producers where they're taking that leaf and then they're doing the extraction process, and then those who are making the edibles that they'd be selling or anything else. So then the state would be able to play the market maker without any insight into what the market is. So we had Maine had the problem of setting a specific rate for that 10% excise tax, and so we would have our Liquor Commission trying to guess what the right market clearing rate is for each of those. So we actually heard testimony from the man who runs the Liquor Commission, and it was pretty interesting to see. He's somebody who works for the state, but he describes himself as a businessman. Before he came in as head of the Liquor Commission, there was $250 million of sales. $350 million of sales through that whole history before he came in about a decade ago. It's been $1 billion in sales since then. So he has grown the liquor market in New Hampshire. So I guess that's being a great businessman. But do we really want more people drinking alcohol? And do we really want the state running these marketing campaigns? I mean, it's been great for education funding. It's been great for everything that we pay for liquor, but it's kind of one of those double-edged swords. So even if you're good with that and you have that experience, but when you're buying liquor from producers all around the world, you're just negotiating the price. They've already made that liquor. They've already put everything into it, and they're simply giving you a price there. They do a great job of knowing what those prices are that they're buying it for and negotiating those contracts. But that doesn't mean that in an industry like cannabis, they'd be able to find what those prices are. Because if you look at it, Jim Beam's not just selling to New Hampshire. They're selling to everybody. But because the fact that we can't have interstate commerce in cannabis, their only buyer is going to be through the state system. So you're going to be controlling it from every single step, every single stage. So the question is this even going to get off the ground if we take the franchise model? There's a lot of people that say, just legalize it now and we'll figure out the rest of it later. But I'm just really afraid that if that franchise model is what we get, we won't be able to fix it. And if you look at Maine, 2018, they passed the referendum, but it didn't get enacted because the governor was against it. The big reason people talk about, let's just do it, let's just take the franchise system, is because the governors that we have coming forward wouldn't legalize cannabis in a way that any of us like. We might have the potential of having a Democrat governor who would do it and then do it super high tax and get intersectionality points as opposed to business operation points. I'd rather have it be based on business. And actually, in our bill, we have it set up, and we charge the Liquor Commission with setting out basically a rubric of what are the qualifications, what are the things we're going to judge your application on. So the process in our bill is very transparent for who's going to be awarded a license. And then we make sure that if they actually don't do it, and if they're just sitting there and they're just rent-seeking, sitting on it and not operating, they will have that license pulled, and it'll go to somebody else. In the competing franchise model, it's simply selected by the Liquor Commission. And in that, any exchange, any move to another entity has to be approved by the Liquor Commission. So I'm going to tell you the worst part about all of these. We're limiting it to 15 stores total for the whole state. Because if it's not a hard 15, the governor won't sign it. So I think there's cities in Maine that have more than 15 stores. We're surrounded on all sides, including Canada, with legal cannabis. Yep. And we think that we can have 15 stores and have them set each of the prices within this whole distribution system in the franchise model and have something effective. Now, it's going to be a hard path through mine, but I think it's quite possible, especially because in our regulatory and licensing scheme where it's transparent, there's more of an opportunity to pull things off. The House, I believe, will always be looking to open that up. We're always pulling back on licensing and occupational licensing and other burdens that are already in place in the state. The Senate's more of a problem, but quite honestly, if we were to pass good cannabis legislation in the future, we need to fix the Senate to do that. And we also it would be good to have a better governor, but if we have a good House and a good Senate, you have enough good people and the governor becomes irrelevant. So in those scenarios, we'll be able to pull a lot of this extra regulation off. But I don't think we can get rid of the franchise, even if we have it, even if we have a supermajority in the House and the Senate. Because once you have somebody in a public-private partnership with the government, that's like the hospital association. That's like the Liquor Commission. Once it's done, it can't be undone. And we also have the problem that the next governor might just sit on it. They might say, this isn't implementable. Under a franchise model, each of those people who are doing a franchise are a franchisee from the franchisor. So we have a bunch of federal agencies that are already involved in this whole cannabis thing. They're still trying to figure out banking, the DEA. They're all sort of backing off in their areas. But the Franchise Tax Board, I think it is, right? The Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission deals with franchises. They've never dealt with cannabis. I mean, you obviously have Mad Men and some of the other ones, some of the products that have franchises. But that's more hands-off than looking at the government being involved as a franchisor. So if you remember the McDonald's issue with the hot coffee, that wasn't just a problem for that store. It was a problem for McDonald's corporate. If the state of New Hampshire is the franchisor, and somebody has problems with their product or problems with their store, that puts the entire state at risk. And even beyond that, even if there's not a specific harm from somebody having bad product or getting hurt in the store, if one of the franchisees thinks that there is a condition of their contract that's a problem, they can have the FTC look into them. They can look into the state. They might even be able to get into our records and look at my emails from passing this, because if I'm colluding in order to sell an illegal product, they might have a reason to do that. There's plenty of agencies that are pretty much backed off because the people of this country have said that cannabis should be legal, and this is ridiculous, basically an individual nullification. But that doesn't mean that if you pull in more bureaucrats, they're not going to go for blood. I mean, New Hampshire, we're wonderful. We have people that have bills to secede from the union. You think that makes us a nice, attractive target if we're going to stand up and be more aggressive in our cannabis? Do you think some people from D.C. are going to want to put us in our place? So why should we make that easy? So I want to actually ask you about public use. So one of the things that we're dealing with is public consumption. We can't get it to the same standard as alcohol. We're fighting at this point, the position we're in is first use is a violation with a $100 fine. Second use is, and you lose the cannabis on your person. Second is a $500 fine, and you lose the cannabis on your person. And the third is a misdemeanor. And so I'm curious what it looks like in Maine, and if it's enforced or if it's not enforced.
It depends where you are and, time of the night, I guess. In Portland, it always kind of smells like cannabis. And if there's, somebody at the State Theater there that night, it could be, smell more like cannabis. I think we ended up doing something similar as far as the fine structure. I wonder if there's even been 50 or 100 citations. People definitely complain either from the grows or the stores, or just sometimes people go and drive around and smoke, and that's the biggest issue probably. The original 2016 initiative had provisions for cannabis hospitality establishments. I had a bill in for that this session for on-site consumption to allow a place where adults go to consume cannabis like we do alcohol. Unfortunately, our governor is not supportive of that, and I ended up kind of withdrawing it from the committee so that we could spend our time trying to peel back some of the regulations, and because there was interest and intention on that from my colleagues, so kind of picking the battles in that regard. But we think it should be on par with alcohol, and we also I don't know where you guys are at with the driving while intoxicated laws. There's been pushes from folks to try to put a per se level for cannabis using the blood alcohol, and we've been able to resist that. I don't think we want vampire cops, number one. I've had to explain to my colleagues that there is a way to test for impairment, and it's the field sobriety test, and it's whether it's cannabis, pills, lack of sleep, alcohol. If you can't drive in a straight line, then you probably shouldn't be driving then. Shouldn't be driving at all, so you should have the book thrown at you. We were able to stop some of those encroachments in liberty. I do think there'll probably be like a saliva test eventually. A free market will figure this out, but we know that cannabis metabolizes in our fat, and different than our alcohol, stays in your system for 30 days. So we really can't, have that be a requirement for, if someone's driving impaired. So that's another issue. On-site consumption.
So we actually have a bill on the driving while intoxicated on a per se limit for cannabis that's coming from the Senate, even without the legalization bill. So they're already working to do that and do the per se level. So that is an issue because there's not a real straight line connection with that one. So the public consumption, so it's just a matter of not enforcing it. Is that just because Portland is just the non-enforcement type city? Or do you think it's because it doesn't pay for the police to actually cite people for it?
Both, and not exclusive to Portland. Folks are pretty comfortable kind of just smoking almost, any kind of sidewalk, just kind of discreetly and politely, and, trying to respect people's boundaries in that way. But, if you live in federally funded like housing or whatnot, you can't consume there. And so where are you supposed to? Especially tourists. Maine, we go from 1.3 million to 30 million every year in population. We're happy to sell them alcohol and cannabis, but they can't use it at their hotel. They can't drive around in their rental or their car and smoke. Where are all the tourists supposed to use the weed that we're selling them? So we're trying to deal with that. On the per se thing, I think Colorado ended up putting in a blood limit, but if you can stop the per se part of that, then that's the most important, because that's like, zero tolerance. You're either impaired or not, and then it doesn't leave any room for like folks who are patients to say, look, this is my walk around limit. This is not my impairment limit. So those are, that's definitely one you want to be careful of. I know at least in Maine, a lot of people smoke weed, and I was on this task force at one point. They were studying this. They wanted to put zero tolerance. If you have any alcohol or any cannabis at all, any mixture, then you're impaired. And half the state at any given time probably has one or the other in them. I know I do, at least. So till I come to New Hampshire, and
it's decriminalized.
That's right,
yeah.
and that I think that helps you know, your activists and you guys, decide, a reason to fight for your bill rather than the franchise bill, because it's still decrimmed and it's worth doing it right, whatever that means. There's a lot of definitions of right, but it definitely sounds like your angle is definitely the more free market, thoughtful approach. So it's worth, failing to get it right.
No, thank you. That's great insight. I guess the last thing that I want to have before we open up to questions is right now, cannabis is decriminalized in the state of New Hampshire. We don't know of anybody that's getting in trouble for simple possession at this point. And it doesn't seem to be an issue as far as we can tell. One of the problems is with this cannabis legalization is that you need to have enough compromises in different places. So right now, the penalty for consuming in public is the penalty for possession with the decriminalization. So you'll forfeit what you have on your person, but it's a violation. We're moving up to a misdemeanor the third time that happens. And right now, that's not the case underneath decriminalization. So we're actually increasing some of the penalties. We're also adding a penalty for smoking in a consuming cannabis in a moving vehicle, because this bill won't pass unless we add the smoking consuming in a vehicle. So that means that even if somebody is consuming a drink that has cannabis in it, or if they're consuming edibles, and a police officer sees them put them in, just like one of our committee members did on camera in a criminal justice hearing. So if they're consuming in a car, that is a new penalty, and they can lose their license over that. So in the compromise for legalization, we've actually stepped backwards a little bit on some of the basic requirements for basic penalties that we have in the land of decriminalization. And it'll be really good to be able to get a market open. And with a better Senate, which we would need in order to get any other legalization in, we're also going to be able to make progress to get those back to a more rational level, get it back a little bit more towards alcohol, even though the consuming in a car actually does get a little closer to the open container laws that we have in liquor. So not sure what's happening in vehicles if that happens. But then again, with a better Senate, we could pass a really good free market bill that would make mine look like junk. But right now, I see a path to approval with my tightly regulated state control model that wouldn't put us in a public-private partnership with government regulators who see themselves as businessmen who get to choose which 5 operators get the licenses in perpetuity. So it's a narrow road. We have it's passed one committee. It's now in finance, and it's very active there. It'll get to the House floor. I figure in whatever configuration it comes out of finance, it probably will pass the House floor, and then move over to the Senate and see what happens. I'd just really like to have the Senate keep their amendments to the Senate, as opposed to do them in the House. We can pass something over to them, and hopefully they'll take a hit and put their stamp on it, or just go ahead and pass it straight through. But I figure I figure that we should do our job in the House and then let the Senate do their thing. So we have a little under 20 minutes for questions, 18 minutes or so. So they have a microphone up here so we can catch it on the webcast on the recording a little bit better. Good.
Start a line.
Do you want to step up to the microphone to ask your question?
So Darrell Eames from the New Hampshire Cannabis Association. I spend a lot of time thinking about models for the state and commissions, and traditionally one of the biggest considerations to legalizing in a state is how do you insulate the state from risk? And so it seems the common consensus has been the government remains a legislative entity. It creates an independent commission, and all the plant-touching activities happen underneath that commission. And if it reports anywhere, it's usually sideways. We've had a few alternative visions here for New Hampshire. The first was the state as the cannabis plant-touching entity, which just means there's no line. You are indeed engaging in that activity. I think the legislators realized that might not be the way to go. And so this franchise concept kind of came up, and, at first blush, it created an arm's length distance between the state and the plant touching activities, until you realize that the relationship is so close, you're still kind of back at square one. So this particular bill uses what we call an agency model, I believe is referred to. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between kind of the standard licensing model and the role of the state in an agency model that provides them with that direct regulation without getting into being under the FTC or the eyes of the federal government?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. So looking at our liquor model, we have our liquor commission, which operates a lot of stores, and then we have some things called agency stores. They're in places where there's not really the population to support a big mega mart for liquor. And what they do there is that they have really tight regulatory control over what happens in those. And the liquor commission is fast to come in and stop anything that's happening in these stores that is not something to their liking. They'll actually, if a church is having a St. Patrick's Day party and they're offering liquor and they don't have the right liquor license, they'll come after the Catholic Church for their St. Patrick's Day party. So it's a pretty tight regulation scheme that's already happening under the Liquor Commission, and they are tightly controlling what's happening there. So using this agency model where it needs to be approved, it needs to be licensed, you're not just able to open up a store. We're working under a state control model, state-run model. But by allowing individual business people to get in there and open up these stores and take on the risk and the reward, that's something that actually can get to a quality market and isn't putting the government in that direct hands-on role. And quite frankly, if we're going to go hands-on, I think we actually have lower risk overall as a state, just jumping in both feet and doing the state-run stores, as opposed to then bringing in the FTC through a franchise model. I'm working hard to get mine done, but if it ends up turning into a franchise model, I'm not going to be able to support that. So,
I guess I'll just talk about how Maine's set up, since I didn't really. We have you're able to be vertically integrated, so you can be the retailer, you can be the cultivator, and you can be the product manufacturer. The manufacturer is who would either make edibles or make concentrate or distillate to go into the vape carts, or to be sold directly, or to go into the edibles. So you can have all three licenses. You can grow and sell your own cannabis. There's labs. You can't have interest in a lab, and vice versa, to have some kind of kind of firewall, but it's not without its issues. And you need local approval to open any of these licenses, and of course state approval. But if you fill out the application, you pay the fee, and you do the work, you can pretty much run the business and be in the cannabis industry in Maine. The requirements are even less to be like a caregiver on the medical side of things as well. And we haven't really had any issues with the feds. I think that's kind of what your question's getting to. I think all the states are still kind of operating under the 2014 Cole memo, Department of Justice memo, that as Colorado came online, they said, all right, well, if these states are going to do this, follow these rules. And it's stuff like we have to do with alcohol, right? Make sure you're not selling to kids. Make sure it's not going across state lines or internationally. Just basic things that would be part of New Hampshire's bill, Maine's bill. And in fact, there's been continuing protections for this activity, at least on the medical side, with the Robacher Amendment that gets tacked on federally every 2 years to make it sure that the federal government can't spend money going after state legal medical operating businesses. That's how we're set up. There's not a lot of barriers to entry. We're trying to lower them and make sure. One of the things that's inevitably going to happen, really in either model with these caps, is that people are going to sue because you have to make a determination about who gets the licenses, whether it's the Liquor Commission guy or the state approving licenses, and even if there is a rubric, one business is going to say, well, we should have got a 10 and they got a 10 and we have this much and they got a 9, so what gives? So you're going to have lawsuits, either there's a lotto, some states have done lottos for applications, some do the rubrics. We don't have a cap. We allow, towns have to opt in, really, so that's our biggest cap. And our biggest bottleneck is the number of stores that have opted in to the number of municipalities that have opted into allowing these retailers.
To what extent is cannabis and alcohol substitutes for each other?
It's a great question. Thank you. There's not a lot of science or studies behind it, but I believe that the stuff that we do have shows gives a little credence to the substitution theory that when cannabis is available, that people drink a little less alcohol. I know if I'm at a party, if I'm using cannabis and alcohol, I'll use less of both because of the way they interact. And I think that's why you also see some of the bigger industries looking at cannabis, because they're involved with alcohol and they already are set up and want to be in that market. It's billions and billions of dollars. But also, just in case if their profits start to go lower, they want to kind of hedge their bets.
And what's the price like between the two in Maine? So the amount of alcohol somebody might use in an evening, or the amount of cannabis they might use in an evening, is the price similar, or is one significantly cheaper?
It's kind of a hard question to answer. I guess it depends on the user and whatnot, but a 6-pack of alcohol, beer is, $8, $12, $14, $16 if it's good stuff. And you can get about an eighth of cannabis for $20, $25. That's 3-4 joints, so it depends on your tolerance. But the price of cannabis has definitely gone significantly lower in Maine over the last 10 years, and I would maybe disagree with my colleague from New Hampshire and say maybe we would prefer more people use cannabis than alcohol. There's some evidence that they're safer drivers. You shouldn't drive either way, but one of them makes you go fast and one of them makes you go slow. And there's science to back that up as well. They wait for the stop sign to turn green. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Senator?
I'm going to ask the final question, Executive Director's prerogative, and then we do have to switch over to the next event in here. But I wanted to ask you both, so I know that in Maine, where Maine really began with the caregiver model, basically a very small micro-business model, and has kind of grown out of that over the years. A lot of the tension in both the medical program and now the adult use program is a tension between small business and big business. Not necessarily always just competing in a free marketplace, but oftentimes big business citing safety and things like that, trying to come in with state laws that would drive small business out of business to effectively monopolize the industry. So my question, I suppose, for Representative Boyer is on the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee right now, with the cannabis industry where it is now. What are you seeing now in terms of that push-pull between small business and big business and monopolization efforts? And to Representative Layon, as you prepare the model that you are trying to advance in New Hampshire, what consideration are you paying to making sure there's space for small businesses to play a role in a future legal cannabis marketplace for New Hampshire?
You go first.
Sure, I can go first. The largest area that we're working to carve out for small businesses is in the manufacturing, in the producer side. So we have a couple different licenses and a few different levels, but we have craft beer. So we essentially have a place for any of the products that you would make from cannabis that would work like craft cannabis. We have a limited producer license that in that limited license, it's going to be a lot less burden so that you can have somebody get involved in the market and have it be, Karen's Cookies. And by doing that, you have more people that can be involved in the market. We also have it so that you can have smaller growers as well. Obviously, there's some scale issues, and there's going to be some places where you're going to have a more competitive product as a larger offering. But by having smaller growers also licensed and also with a different licensing cap carved out, that's going to give more opportunity for Granite Staters that want to participate to be a part of the market. That's something that is not there in the franchise bill. And they've spoken, the people who are following that have spoken about the idea of essentially giving like a crab quota to everybody who's producing. And when you're looking at assigning quotas to different growers, you're going to be leaning towards those larger growers. And then we look at the problem where people come in, flood a market, and then leave, or flood a market, push out their competitors, and then work with that. So we've carved out a lot of spaces for craft cannabis, both in products and in growing. And that's why I think that it's so important to push forward with a model that does allow small business to participate, as opposed to one that's just about big business colluding with the government.
Let's see. In Maine, we're dealing with taking some of the stigma and the over-regulation and burdensome regulations out of the adult use program now. By and large, we have a lot of unity across the different sizes of operators in that respect, but there was some cannabis businesses kind of all associated this one lawyer, and they testified against it, and they didn't really have any good reasons or rationale, and I think it's more, and they would benefit from everything in the bill, so I think it was more like, this is going to make it too easy for everyone else, and these regulations help us, so we don't want to make it easier for everyone to get into the market. They want that regulatory capture, so that's something to think about, and something that we're working to fix. We're looking at kind of creative solutions to encourage the small grower, the small business, because the way we're set up between the seed to sell software, the laboratory testing, and whatnot, the best businesses are the ones that are built for scale. But not everyone wants to do that, and you lose quality when you go so big. So things that we're doing to try to allow those smaller growers to compete, allow the tier 1, tier 2 growers to deliver directly to the consumer rather than having to, sell their product to the retailer and do it that way. Some of the retail stores become gatekeepers at some point and kind of grind on the price between the farmer and the retailer. I think those are the considerations that we're dealing with, and just trying to create parity with the alcohol industry on those big things that we're talking about, like advertising, like regulations. That was a very good question, Eric.
Yeah, that regulatory capture is so huge. That's what we're dealing with in the healthcare market. And are we going to create the Hospital Association 2.0 with the cannabis cartel, or are we going to make sure that we do it the right way?